By the time I understood why the town knew my name, it was already too late. If you're hearing this, then I need you to listen carefully. Not because I think you can help me now. That part is long gone. But because maybe, if I tell it exactly as it happened, someone else will recognize the signs before they make the same mistake I did. 6 months ago, I took a job in the mountains of northwestern Montana. On paper, it looked simple. A private estate. Remote property management. Good money. Good enough to solve every problem I had at the time. Good enough to make me ignore the parts that didn't make sense. The contract said I had to arrive alone. It said I couldn't leave for 6 months. It said outside contact would be limited. No visitors. No exceptions. Just me, a massive estate in the middle of nowhere, and a wealthy employer who seemed far more concerned with secrecy than maintenance. At first, I told myself it was just one of those eccentric rich man arrangements. Some billionaire with a private mountain retreat and a taste for paranoia. But the moment I got there, something felt wrong. Not obviously wrong. Not in a way I could point to and explain. More like stepping into a place that had already been waiting for me. Then the night started. The screaming in the woods. The tracks in the mud that looked almost human. If a human had been stretched into something taller, thinner, hungrier. Then I drove into town for supplies, and people I had never met smiled at me like an old friend. They called me by name. They asked me where I'd been. They talked to me like I'd been living there for years. And when I tried to tell them I had only arrived the day before, they looked at me the same way you look at someone who's saying something they don't understand is impossible. That was when the real fear started. Not because of the house. Not because of the woods. Not even because of the thing that circled the property at night. But because somewhere between signing that contract and driving into town, I had already lost time. And the deeper I dug into the history of that estate, the more I began to understand that I was never hired to watch over that place. I was brought there for it. What waited on that mountain didn't just want my life. It wanted my name. My face. My memories. Piece by piece, it began taking all of it, until there was almost nothing left of me except the part that was still scared enough to run. So if you ever find yourself tempted by a job that pays too much to ask questions, if you ever arrive somewhere remote and feel, for just a second, like the place already knows you, leave. Leave before the locals start recognizing you. Leave before you start waking up on the wrong date. Leave before you hear something outside your window that doesn't move like any animal should. Because if I had left the first day, maybe I'd still be human. Before we begin, I'd be thrilled if you'd hit the like button, subscribe, and hit on the notification bell. It helps me continue sharing my experiences from places most people never see. And if you've had a strange experience in the wild, write it in the comments. I'd love to hear your story. Now, let's get into it. It started with an email I should have deleted. The message sat in my inbox for 3 full days before I opened it. I saw it the first morning it came in, half awake, standing in my kitchen in a pair of thermal socks with stale coffee in my hand and the heater rattling uselessly against the Wyoming cold. I almost trashed it right then. The subject line read, "Property Management Opportunity, Competitive Compensation." That alone was enough to make me suspicious. It sounded sterile. Corporate. The kind of message you get when someone wants to sell you a timeshare, a fake crypto investment, or a job that somehow turns into wiring money to a stranger in another country. I marked it unread and moved on. But over the next 3 days, it stayed there. Every time I checked my inbox, it sat near the top like it was waiting on me specifically. At the time, I had been out of work for almost 4 months. I'd spent most of my adult life making a living where roads ended and tourists got nervous. Guiding hunting trips. Leading backcountry hikes. Running survival and tracking excursions for out-of-state clients who wanted a taste of wilderness without actually understanding what wilderness was. In spring and summer, there was enough work to get by. In early fall, if I was lucky, I could make enough to build a cushion. But Wyoming winters don't care about your plans. By late November, the calls had dried up. The bookings stopped. Wealthy clients stayed home. Outfitters cut hours. Seasonal contracts vanished. And little by little, the money I'd spent years scraping together started draining out of my account in rent, gas, groceries, insurance, and the thousand smaller expenses that feel harmless until they've bled you dry. By the time I finally opened the email, my checking account was low enough that I had started doing math in my head every time I walked through a grocery store. Not what I wanted. What I could justify. That was the kind of place I was in. Not hopeless. Just cornered. I clicked on the message expecting very little and trying not to expect anything at all. The sender's name was what stopped me from deleting it. William Blackwell, CEO, Blackwell Holdings. I knew the name, vaguely. Not personally, obviously. But I'd heard it before. Commercial real estate. Resort acquisitions. Private developments. One of those companies that own so much land in so many places that its name just drifted through enough headlines to sound legitimate, even if you couldn't say exactly why. The email itself was short, cold, efficient. It began. Mr. Mitchell, your experience in wilderness operations, remote property oversight, and self-sufficiency has been brought to my attention. I own a substantial private estate in northwestern Montana, requiring on-site maintenance and security. The position requires a 6-month commitment beginning immediately. Compensation is considerable. That was the first line. Then came the number. I read it once. Then again. Then I actually sat down at the table because for a second I thought I'd misread it. The salary for 6 months was more money than I usually made in 2 years. Not close to 2 years. More. The kind of number that doesn't just solve your current problems. It erases them. It buys breathing room. It buys time. It gives you back the part of your brain that financial panic slowly eats. I kept reading. The offer became stranger the further down it went. The property was remote. Extremely remote, according to Blackwell. The successful candidate would be required to remain on site for the full 6-month duration of the contract. No visitors would be permitted under any circumstances. Outside communication would be limited to weekly email reports sent to Blackwell's office. The position required complete self-sufficiency, though supplies would be stocked in advance and hunting would be allowed within property boundaries. Then came the line that should have made me close the email and forget I'd ever seen it. You must arrive alone and remain on the property for the duration of your contract. No leaving. Not for emergencies, unless otherwise instructed. Not for supply runs. Not to take a break. Not at all. I reread that section more times than I want to admit. At first, I told myself there had to be a practical reason. Maybe it was a liability issue. Maybe the property was tied up in legal disputes. Maybe Blackwell was dealing with stalkers, trespassers, or something sensitive that required isolation and discretion. Wealthy people build bizarre little worlds around themselves. I'd seen enough of that on private land contracts to know it wasn't impossible. Still, something about the wording bothered me. It didn't sound like the estate needed a caretaker. It sounded like it needed a witness. Or maybe a prisoner. I leaned back in my chair and stared out the apartment window at a parking lot half buried in snow. A man across the street was scraping ice off his windshield with a credit card. My sink had 2 plates in it and a bottle of cheap beer sweating on the counter. The thermostat read 61, and I'd only turned it up that high because my fingers were starting to ache. That's the part people never really understand when they talk about bad decisions. Most of them don't feel like bad decisions when you make them. They feel like narrowing options. Like arithmetic. A strange contract becomes easier to accept when your landlord has started sending reminders instead of invoices. When your truck needs work. When your savings account has become a number you avoid looking at too often because each time you do, it feels smaller than it should. I wasn't greedy. If I had been comfortable, if I'd had steady work, if there'd been another season lined up, I would have laughed at the email and deleted it. But I wasn't comfortable. I was running out of road. So I opened a new tab and started checking Blackwell Holdings. And that was the worst possible thing for my instincts, because the company was real. Very real. A polished corporate site. Archived press releases. Property portfolios in multiple states. Holdings in Chicago, resort developments in Michigan, industrial land across the Midwest. Enough tax records, business filings, and trade mentions to reassure anyone willing to be reassured. I checked William Blackwell too. Also real. Interviews in business journals. A keynote speech at a development conference. A photograph of him standing in front of some ribbon-cutting event in a gray suit and a smile that looked expensive and practiced. Nothing about the company felt improvised. Nothing about it felt fake. That gave the offer just enough legitimacy to become dangerous. I went back to the email and read it one more time, slower this time. Looking for anything openly criminal. Anything that would let me reject it without feeling stupid. But there was nothing clear enough to point at. Just oddness. Restrictions. Specificity. Too much money. I remember sitting there with the cursor blinking in the reply box for a long time. Then I attached my resume. Even then, I still expected silence. I figured maybe I'd hear back in a week. Maybe never. Maybe the job had already been filled and the email was just some mass outreach to a dozen people with similar experience. Instead, I got a response before I'd finished my beer. It was from Blackwell's office. Professional. Immediate. Efficient. They thanked me for my quick reply and said my background appeared well suited to the role. Attached was a more detailed overview of the property, along with a formal contract for review. That should have felt exciting. Instead, I remember a very small, very cold feeling settling in behind my ribs. Because if they moved that fast with everyone, maybe the job had trouble keeping people. And if they moved that fast just with me, maybe they'd already decided I was exactly what they were looking for. When the contract arrived, it only got stranger. There were 3 attachments. The first was a formal employment contract in PDF form. The second was a property overview with maps, utility notes, and a basic maintenance schedule. The third was a confidentiality agreement so detailed it was almost longer than the contract itself. I downloaded everything and sat there for a moment, just looking at the files without opening them. Outside, the sky had already gone dark. The windows over my sink reflected my kitchen back at me like black mirrors. In that reflection, I looked tired. Leaner than I remembered. The kind of tired that doesn't come from missing sleep, but from dragging uncertainty around for too long. Then I opened the first document. The estate was in northwestern Montana, not far from Glacier National Park, though not far in that part of the country still meant remote enough to vanish in. The property itself covered just under 500 acres and bordered national forest on one side. There was a main house, several outbuildings, a private access road, a northern lake zone, hunting sections, maintenance routes, and clearly marked boundary lines that would be my responsibility to inspect and preserve. The house was described in sterile terms: primary residence, backup power system, satellite communications, well water, cold weather storage, workshop space. But even through a document full of clean formatting and bullet points, it sounded enormous. A private mountain estate in the middle of nowhere. Remote enough that self-sufficiency wasn't a suggestion. It was a condition. The contract laid out my duties in almost military detail. I would maintain the structures, inspect and service equipment, patrol marked sections of the property, monitor fences, blazes, and boundary markers, keep detailed weekly logs and email reports, remain on site for the full term of 6 months. No visitors. No unauthorized contact. No leaving the property for any reason except under express written instruction from Blackwell Holdings. That line appeared more than once, each time phrased a little differently, as if they wanted to make sure there was no possibility of misunderstanding. One section specifically addressed hunting. It was permitted within certain zones marked on the property maps and was encouraged as a supplement to stocked supplies. There were notes about local wildlife, safe storage of firearms, carcass disposal, and reporting predator activity if observed near the main residence. That part made sense to me. It felt practical, familiar, the kind of thing I'd expect from a remote property. But the deeper I got into the paperwork, the less it felt like a normal caretaker job and the more it felt like a system designed around containment. The confidentiality clauses were the first thing that really bothered me. I'd signed non-disclosure agreements before. Guiding work for high-profile clients, private hunting leases, exclusive retreat properties. None of that was unusual. Rich people liked privacy. Some treated it like oxygen. But this was different. This language was obsessive. It prohibited disclosure of the property's location, condition, occupants past or present, business conducted on site, and environmental irregularities or emergent conditions observed during the term of employment. I remember stopping on that phrase. Environmental irregularities or emergent conditions. That's not how anyone describes a plumbing failure, or storm damage, or trespassers. I reread it twice, then a third time. Maybe it was just legal overreach. Maybe some lawyer had packed the contract with broad language to cover every possibility. That was the explanation I gave myself. It was the easiest one to live with. Then I reached the payment schedule. Half of the total amount would be wired immediately upon signing. The remaining half would be paid on successful completion of the 6-month term. I actually laughed when I saw it, but not because it was funny. More because I couldn't believe anyone with real money moved that way. Most employers dragged their feet over a hotel reimbursement. This man was offering to drop more money into my account tonight than I'd had access to in years. And that was the point where the offer became truly dangerous. Because all the strange parts of the contract, the isolation, the secrecy, the no-leaving clause, the excessive conditions, started shrinking in proportion to what sat on the other side of my signature. I printed the contract and spread the pages across my kitchen table. The printer sounded too loud in the apartment. Each sheet came out warm and official-looking, covered in blocks of neat legal language that somehow felt more persuasive on paper than they had on a screen. I opened a beer, sat down, and read the whole thing again from beginning to end. No obvious crime. No hidden fee. No demand that I front any money. No sudden mention of surveillance, illegal transport, or anything else that would let common sense slam on the brakes. Just a strange job in a strange place with money attached to it that felt almost obscene. I called my sister Beth because I knew if I didn't, and this turned into a disaster, she'd eventually ask why I hadn't at least said it out loud to someone first. Beth was older than me by 3 years and had spent most of our lives acting as if she'd inherited all the caution our family had to offer. She was practical in a way I'd never managed to be. The one who read warranties. The one who checked references. The one who could hear me explain a perfectly survivable bad idea and somehow make me feel like I was standing on a roof in a lightning storm. She picked up on the third ring. "Hey," she said. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I said, and then immediately heard in my own voice that I sounded like a man about to explain why everything was not okay. "Actually, I might have a job." There was a pause. A real one. I smiled despite myself. Very funny. She listened while I explained the broad version. A caretaker job. Remote property. 6 months. Good money. Montana. I didn't tell her everything. I left out the stranger parts of the confidentiality language. I softened the no-contact rules. I made it sound more temporary and less absolute than it really was. Not because I was deliberately hiding it, at least not at first. More because saying the weird parts out loud made them harder to ignore. When I told her the salary, she went quiet. Then she said exactly what I knew she would say. "That sounds too good to be true." "Maybe," I admitted. "But the company's real." I checked them out. They've got holdings all over the Midwest. Chicago, Michigan, all over. And they want you to live alone in the woods for 6 months, she said. Doing what, exactly? Property management. Maintenance. Security. It's probably just some rich guy's vacation place. She exhaled into the phone, and I could already hear the skepticism hardening. Tom, what are you guarding up there? Nuclear secrets. I laughed, because I wanted it to sound ridiculous. Yeah, probably. In a timber lodge near Glacier. I'm serious. So am I. It's probably taxes and paranoia. Maybe he had break-ins. Maybe he doesn't trust staff. Beth didn't answer right away. Then she said quieter, "It still sounds wrong." I looked down at the contract spread out in front of me. At my own initials penciled in the margins where I'd marked sections to revisit. At the total amount listed near the end, impossible and clean and waiting. Maybe, I said again. But I need the work. That was the truest thing I'd said all night, and she heard it. The tone of her voice changed after that. Not accepting. Just gentler. Okay, she said. Then send me the exact location before you go. And call me when you can. I'll email, I said. Tom. I know. If this gets weird, you leave. There was a beat there. Long enough that I should have said yes immediately. Instead I said, it's just 6 months. And in hindsight, I think that was the moment I really decided. Not when I opened the email. Not when I read the salary. Not even when I printed the contract. It was then, when someone who loved me gave me one clear condition for my own safety, and I answered with the lie I needed in order to move forward. After he hung up, I sat at the table for another 10 minutes. I read the contract one last time, slower than before, looking for some final excuse to reject it. Something concrete. Something undeniable. But all I found were red flags arranged neatly enough to resemble terms. And because I needed the money more than I trusted the warning in my gut, I signed. I scanned the pages and sent them back to Blackwell Holdings just before midnight. 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed on the table beside the empty beer bottle. I picked it up and stared at the banking alert. The first payment had landed. Just like that. No delay. No follow-up call. No welcome packet. No negotiation. A sum of money so large it looked unreal sitting in my account, glowing up at me from a cracked phone screen in a dark kitchen. That should have scared me more than it did. Instead, I felt relief. Deep, humiliating relief. For the first time in months, the weight on my chest loosened. Bills stopped feeling immediate. Rent stopped feeling like a countdown. I could fix the truck. Buy supplies. Get ahead for once instead of clawing at the edge of staying afloat. That's what money like that does. It doesn't just tempt you. It edits your instincts. By the time I went to bed, the contract was signed, the money was real, and the part of me that still thought the whole thing felt wrong was already being drowned out by practical details. What to pack? How much ammunition to bring? How many books 6 months alone might require? Whether the roads would still be open if the weather turned early. Questions like that. Manageable questions. Useful questions. The kind you ask when you've already committed yourself and don't want to look back at the door closing behind you. By morning, my truck was packed. By the next afternoon, I was driving into Montana. And somewhere along that road, I started getting the feeling I'd already been there before. By morning, my truck was packed. By the next afternoon, I was driving into Montana. And somewhere along that road, I started getting the feeling I'd already been there before. I loaded like I was leaving civilization, not taking a job. Years of guiding had taught me that isolation punishes optimism. If there's even a chance you might need it, you bring it. If there's any chance no one's coming to help, you plan like help doesn't exist. So I packed my hunting rifle and my shotgun, both cleaned and oiled. Extra boxes of ammunition. My winter layers, wool base clothes, insulated jackets, waterproof outerwear, heavy gloves, thermal socks, and boots built for snow that came up to the knee. I packed tools I trusted because I knew I might have to become my own mechanic, carpenter, and electrician if anything failed out there. Hand tools, duct tape, spare hardware, rope, sharpening stones, batteries, lanterns. I packed food too, even though the contract said the estate would be stocked. Canned goods, jerky, rice, coffee, protein bars. Things that kept and didn't complain. A decent first aid kit with antibiotics and painkillers, burn cream, wraps, and enough over-the-counter medication to get through a month of flu or a bad injury if I had to. I threw in books because they weigh less than loneliness if you choose them right. A couple old paperbacks I'd been meaning to read, a field guide, a survival manual I'd owned for years, and one novel I'd already read twice just because I knew it would feel familiar. By the time I was done, the truck looked less like I was moving and more like I was preparing to disappear. The drive north out of Wyoming was the kind that gives you too much room to think. The highway unwound through open country first, long pale stretches of road, winter-brown grassland, fenced cattle fields, low hills under a washed-out sky. Then gradually, almost without me noticing, the land started lifting. Trees thickened. Rock cut through the earth in dark seams. The horizon stopped feeling open and started feeling enclosed. Montana has a way of making distance feel older than it is. The farther I drove, the larger everything became. The mountains weren't scenic in the usual sense. They didn't look welcoming. They looked permanent. Ancient in the way only certain landscapes do, so old and self-contained that human plans seem temporary even while you're making them. The ridgelines rose in layered shapes against the sky, dark with timber and shadow, and every mile north made me feel smaller. Under different circumstances, I would have enjoyed it. That's the strange part. I've spent most of my life in places where silence means space, where distance means freedom, where a tree line is something to move toward, not away from. Wilderness had never frightened me in a general sense. I understood it. I respected it. Most of the dangers out there obeyed rules if you knew what to look for. But as the afternoon wore on, I began noticing something I couldn't fit into those rules. Little moments. Nothing dramatic. A slope of land beside the road that felt instantly familiar even though I knew I'd never driven through that stretch of Montana in my life. A bend in the highway where I caught myself thinking, absurdly, that I knew what the next mountain would look like before it came into view. Then it did. A jagged silhouette, distinctive enough that I should have remembered seeing it before if I ever had. I felt a pulse of cold move through me so quickly I actually glanced in the rearview mirror, like I expected to see someone else in the cab. "That's weird," I said out loud, just to break the silence. My own voice sounded thin inside the truck. I kept driving. A minute later, the feeling passed. I chalked it up to nerves. Or fatigue. Or one of those tricks your brain plays when roads and ridgelines start blending together after hours behind the wheel. That explanation was enough at the time. Not because it was convincing. Because it was convenient. By late afternoon, the GPS was guiding me farther west, then north again, the roads narrowing as I moved closer to the outer edges of Glacier Country. The signs of ordinary life became less frequent. Fewer gas stations. Fewer homes. Fewer fences. More timber. More mountains. More stretches of road where the only thing ahead of me was a strip of asphalt disappearing into dark trees. My cell signal started dropping in and out not long after I passed the larger towns. One bar. Then none. Then a brief return. Then nothing at all. I remember checking my phone more than once as if the service might somehow come back if I looked disappointed enough. It didn't. The dead screen in the corner where the signal bar should have been made the drive feel different in a way that's hard to explain unless you've done real remote travel alone. It's not just inconvenience. It's a change in pressure. A subtle shift in how exposed you feel once you know no call is going out and nothing is coming in. Still, I had maps. Fuel. Gear. Directions. There was no practical reason to feel uneasy yet. So I drove on. The roads got narrower the closer I came to my destination. Blacktop gave way to rougher surfaces. Shoulders disappeared. Patches of old snow sat in the shadows where the sunlight no longer reached. Pines crowded close enough to the road in places that it felt like driving down a corridor cut through dark living walls. By the time the last real town appeared ahead of me, I was more relieved than I wanted to admit. Kalispell was the final substantial stop before I'd have to commit fully to the route Blackwell's office had sent. I pulled in for gas first, then sat there for a minute with the engine idling, hands resting on the wheel, looking at the storefronts and parked trucks and people moving between them. Normal life. Warm light in windows. The low comfort of strangers doing ordinary things. It struck me then that this was probably the last place I'd see for a long time where, if I changed my mind, I could still turn around without effort. Instead, I decided to make one final supply run. I found a large outfitter store near the edge of town and parked beside a pair of mud-covered pickups and a trailer loaded with firewood. The air hit me sharp when I stepped out, colder than it had been farther south, with that particular mountain bite that gets into the sinuses and wakes you up immediately. Inside, the place smelled like canvas, rubber, coffee, gun oil, and wet wool. It was the kind of store I trusted on instinct. High shelves. Practical gear. No decorative nonsense. The kind of place that exists because bad weather and long distances make preparedness non-negotiable. I grabbed extra ammunition first. Then more batteries. Additional non-perishable food. A heavier pair of gloves than the ones I already had. A thick insulated outer layer I hadn't planned on buying until I thought about 6 months in Montana and decided not to argue with the season. I picked up a few small things too: waterproof matches, hand warmers, a spare flashlight, another roll of utility cord. The basket got heavier as I moved, and with each item, I felt a little steadier. Preparedness has a way of imitating confidence. At the register, the man ringing me up looked to be in his late 60s. Broad hands. Gray beard. Thick-lined face that suggested a lifetime outdoors had carved him more than age had. He glanced over the pile of gear and gave the kind of small nod people in those places use instead of conversation. "Quite a haul," he said. "You headed out for hunting season?" "Not exactly," I said. "Taking a property job up near Hungry Horse." He kept scanning for a second, then stopped. Not dramatically. Just enough for me to notice. "Up near Hungry Horse," he repeated. "Yeah." He looked up at me then, really looked, and there was a shift in his expression I still remember clearly. Not surprise exactly. Recognition wrapped in discomfort. "The Blackwell place," he said. It wasn't a question. I felt my hand pause over my wallet. "You know it." He finished scanning a box of batteries and set it aside without answering right away. "Know of it," he said finally. Something in the way he said it made the space between us feel narrower. "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked, trying to sound lighter than I felt. He shrugged, but the gesture was too stiff to be casual. "Just means they've had a lot of caretakers." That was the second time I'd heard some version of that in less than 24 hours, and I remember an irrational flash of irritation rising in me. Probably because some part of me already knew I was collecting warnings and filing them where I couldn't use them. "What happened to them?" I asked. The old man slid the receipt toward me and finally met my eyes. "People don't tend to stay long up there." Then, before I could ask anything else, he turned his head toward the next customer waiting behind me like the conversation had ended on its own. "That was where someone first warned me about the Blackwell place." That was where someone first warned me about the Blackwell place. I stood there at the register with a plastic basket full of things a person buys when he's preparing to live alone through a mountain winter. Extra food, batteries, ammunition, cold weather gear, a better flashlight than the one I already had, and enough small practical supplies to make me feel like I still had some control over what I was driving into. The fluorescent lights above us gave everything in the store that flat, washed-out look small-town places get after dark. Coats hanging in rows. Ice augers. Trail maps. Stacks of wool socks. A rack of orange hunting caps turning slowly in the draft from the front door each time somebody came in. The heat was on too high, and the windows along the front had fogged slightly from the cold outside. It should have felt ordinary. That's what bothered me the most looking back. How normal the moment was right until it wasn't. The old man behind the register had the kind of face you only get from decades of weather. Creased, windburned, and serious without trying to be. His hands were broad and slow in that economical way older men move when they've spent long enough doing physical work that they no longer waste motion. He didn't strike me as talkative. Just one of those men who asks one polite question while bagging your things, not because he cares much about your answer, but because silence can feel ruder in a place that small. "Quite a haul," he'd said, glancing over my pile of supplies. "You headed up for hunting season?" "Not exactly," I said. "Taking a job managing a property up near Hungry Horse." That was when he slowed. Not enough to seem theatrical. Just enough that I noticed his hand stopped moving for half a second over a box of batteries. He looked up at me, and something unreadable passed across his face. "The Blackwell place," he said. Again, not a question. The way he said it bothered me immediately. Not because he knew the property. In towns like that, people know every large private tract within 50 miles. But because he said it with the kind of certainty you use when you aren't identifying a place so much as invoking it. "Yeah," I said. "Actually. You know it." His eyes dropped back to the register, but not before I saw a flicker of something there. Not fear exactly. The shape of old discomfort. He finished scanning a pack of hand warmers, set it aside, then pulled the receipt free with a dry tearing sound that seemed too loud in the moment. "Know of it," he said. "There are answers people give when they want a conversation. And there are answers people give when they want one to stop. That was the second kind." Still, I pushed a little. "What's that mean?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stacked one of the boxes more neatly than it needed to be, lined up the edge with the others, then finally slid the receipt toward me across the counter. "They've gone through a lot of caretakers up there," he said. That landed a little differently than it should have. At the time, I told myself I was hearing too much in his voice because the contract was already sitting in the back of my mind like a splinter. But there was something deliberate in the way he said, "a lot." Something like he didn't mean turnover in the usual sense. Not people quitting. Not jobs changing hands. Something else. "What happened to them?" I asked. The old man's jaw shifted a little, and he looked past me toward the dark windows at the front of the store before answering. Then he said it. "People don't stay long." He said it quietly. No drama. No smile. No folksy superstition in his voice. Just a fact delivered with the flat certainty of somebody who had lived close enough to a thing for long enough to stop dressing it up for strangers. People don't stay long. There was a pause after that. One of those strange little silences that seems to gather around a sentence once it's spoken, as if the room itself understands more than you do. I waited for him to continue. He didn't. "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked. He shrugged then, but the motion felt wrong, like someone reaching for casualness a second too late. "Means exactly what it sounds like." I almost laughed. Not because I found any of it amusing, but because part of me was still trying very hard to fit the exchange into a familiar category. Rural gossip. Rich family rumors. The usual stories people build around old money and remote land. Every isolated town has one property people talk about differently than the others. Usually because someone from away bought too much acreage and built a fence where no fence had been before. That's what I told myself while I slid my card into the machine. That's what I told myself while the old man bagged my things without meeting my eyes again. That's what I told myself because the alternative required me to believe that a complete stranger had just recognized the place I was going and, without saying much of anything at all, managed to make me feel like I was driving toward a bad memory I hadn't made yet. When the receipt printed, he tore it off and handed it to me between two fingers. I took it and looked at him one last time. "You mind being a little more specific?" For a second, I thought he might. There was that tiny hesitation again. That almost decision. Then whatever thought had risen behind his eyes flattened out. "Small towns have stories," he said. "That's all." It was such an unsatisfying answer that it almost worked on me. Almost. I picked up the bags and turned toward the door. The heat of the store gave way to sharp mountain cold the second I stepped outside. My truck sat alone under the lot lights, breath-white exhaust drifting from the tailpipe. Beyond the parking lot, the town looked dim and practical and far too ordinary to support the kind of unease I had just carried out of that store with my supplies. As I loaded the bags into the truck bed, I kept replaying his tone in my head. Not what he said. How he said it. The Blackwell place. People don't stay long. On another day, with another job, maybe it would have been enough to make me rethink things. But I had already signed. Half the money was already in my account. And by then I had crossed a point most bad choices have hidden inside them. The point where backing out starts to feel more embarrassing than pressing on. So I did what people almost always do when reality offers them a warning they aren't emotionally prepared to accept. I downgraded it. I told myself he was feeding me local legend because I looked like an outsider. I told myself the caretaker remark probably meant the owner was difficult, or the winters were brutal, or the work was more than people expected. I told myself rich private properties attract rumors because they're private. And because if there's one thing isolated communities know how to do, it's turn silence into folklore. By the time I climbed back into the truck, I had almost convinced myself. Almost. I checked the printed directions one last time. Follow the highway. Turn north. Continue until the pavement narrowed. Then farther still. Into timber. Into elevation. Into whatever waited beyond the reach of ordinary maps and ordinary explanations. I started the engine and pulled back onto the road. The town lights shrank behind me faster than I expected. Within minutes they were gone, swallowed by forest and bends in the road. Ahead of me, the mountains had begun to darken into shape rather than detail, their ridgelines cutting black against the last of the evening sky. I should have turned around then. Instead, I kept driving deeper into the mountains. I should have turned around then. Instead, I kept driving deeper into the mountains. The farther I went, the worse the road became. The highway gave way to narrower county roads. Then those gave way to long gravel stretches carved through dense pine forest. The trees closed in gradually at first, then all at once, until it felt less like I was driving through wilderness and more like I was being funneled into it. My headlights swept over trunks packed so tightly together that the spaces between them looked black even before the sun had fully gone down. The road started climbing. Hairpin turns forced me to slow to a crawl in places. The truck's engine strained on the steeper inclines, and every now and then the suspension jolted hard enough over washed-out patches to make something metal rattle in the truck bed. Branches leaned in from the edges of the road and scraped along the side panels with dry fingernail sounds that made me glance at the mirrors more than once. There were no other headlights. No houses. No mailboxes. No sign that anyone lived anywhere near where I was going. At one point I rounded a bend and found myself staring at a stretch of road so narrow and overgrown that for a second I honestly wondered if the GPS had glitched and sent me down an old service path. But the coordinates held steady. The route was correct. Every turn I made took me farther in. By then daylight had started collapsing fast. That mountain kind of dusk where the sky can still hold color, but the forest floor is already dark. The temperature seemed to drop with every mile, and the pines around me rose straight and silent like they'd been standing there long before roads were cut through them. I remember thinking then, not for the first time, that the money must be for the isolation. That had to be it. No one else wanted to stay out there that long. No one sane, maybe. Wealthy people paid a premium to make discomfort someone else's problem. That explanation held together right up until the moment I finally saw the house. I came around one last bend in the road, and there it was. The Blackwell estate sat in a clearing ringed by timber and backed by mountain slope, the whole property pressed into that stretch of land as if it had been dropped there from somewhere wealthier and less wild. The house was much larger than I'd imagined from the documents. Not just a cabin or a seasonal lodge, but a proper mountain residence. Broad, heavy timbered, built in that expensive rustic style people use when they want a place to look rugged without sacrificing comfort. A wide covered porch stretched across the front. Massive support beams framed the entryway. Stonework anchored the lower half of the structure, while dark wood and high windows gave the upper levels the look of an upscale retreat more than a working wilderness property. It should have looked inviting. Instead, my first thought was that it looked staged. Not fake exactly. Just too complete. Too composed against the rawness around it. I pulled into the gravel drive and cut the engine. The silence hit immediately. Not just the absence of traffic or voices. A fuller silence than that. The kind that arrives so suddenly after a running engine that it almost feels physical, like pressure changing around your head. For a few seconds, all I could hear was the ticking of cooling metal from under the hood and the faint settling creak of gear in the truck bed. Then that faded too. I sat there with both hands still on the wheel, looking at the house through the windshield. No movement in the windows. No porch light flickering. No sign of anyone. And yet somehow, it didn't feel empty. I got out and the cold air bit straight through my jacket. The whole property smelled of pine, wet stone, and that sharp clean-edge mountain air gets right before true winter settles in. I took a slow look around while I stretched my back from the drive. The grounds were one of the first things that felt wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not enough that I could have pointed to anything and called it impossible. Just wrong in the way a detail misfits before your mind knows why. The gravel of the drive was even and recently maintained. The path to the porch had been cleared cleanly. Firewood was stacked along one wall in neat, deliberate rows. There were no drifts of blown leaves in the corners, no visible neglect, no signs that the place had been left alone long enough to need a caretaker in the first place. If anything, it looked like someone had prepared it for my arrival. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it made me feel, for the first time, vaguely unnecessary. I grabbed the duffel with my essentials and the key packet Blackwell's office had couriered to me back in Wyoming. The front door lock gave with a solid, well-maintained click, and I stepped inside expecting the place to feel cold and seasonal. It didn't. The warmth caught me first. Then the contrast. Outside, the house presented itself as a wilderness lodge. Heavy timber. Stone. Distance. But inside, it opened into something far more polished. The floors were hardwood, clean enough to reflect light. The ceilings were high and crossed with exposed beams, but the lighting set into them was modern and expensive. The main room had a huge leather sectional arranged around a stone fireplace, and built-in bookshelves lined one wall with rows of hardcovers that looked chosen more by decorator than reader. To the left, the kitchen opened out from the main living area, and it looked like something out of a luxury listing. Granite countertops. Stainless steel appliances. A large central island. Professional-grade range. Cabinets in dark wood, all immaculate. I remember actually saying quietly, not exactly roughing it. My own voice vanished into the room. There were more details the longer I looked. A wine fridge. An entertainment setup too expensive for a place supposedly used only as a remote retreat, though the contract had already made it clear there'd be no actual television service. Artwork on the walls that looked original, or at least expensive enough that I didn't want to guess wrong. Nothing about the interior matched the rough practical job I'd imagined while reading the offer. It felt less like I'd been hired to maintain a mountain property and more like I'd been allowed into someone else's private life. That feeling deepened when I reached the kitchen island. There were two things waiting there, set neatly side by side as if they'd been placed only moments before. The first was a thick binder with property management stamped cleanly across the spine. The second was a sealed envelope with my name written on the front in a hand too careful to be casual. I set my bag down and opened the envelope first. Inside was a short typed note. No greeting beyond my name. No warmth. No welcome beyond formality. It read, "Mr. Mitchell, welcome to the property. Everything you need to know is in the manual. Remember our agreement. Complete isolation. Weekly reports. Property boundaries maintained. The pantry and freezer are fully stocked. Hunting zones are marked on the provided maps. Your first report is due in 7 days. William Blackwell." That was it. I stood there in that beautiful kitchen holding a note from a man I had never met, in a house so prepared that it should have made me feel secure, and instead all I felt was the faintest pull of unease. The message wasn't threatening. It wasn't even impolite. But there was something in its tone, something absolute and sterile, that made it read less like instructions and more like terms already in effect. I put the note down and opened the binder. Inside was a manual so organized it bordered on obsessive. Daily maintenance checklists. Weekly inspection schedules. Utility breakdowns. Generator procedures. Water system notes. Maps of the entire property with boundaries marked in bold red lines. Outbuildings labeled. Hunting zones shaded. Fence and marker inspection routes listed by distance and priority. The land, according to those documents, was even larger in practice than it had sounded on paper. Nearly 500 acres pressed up against national forest, with enough terrain variation to create blind spots, weather pockets, and dead ground I'd need days to learn properly. Whoever had assembled that manual had not done it casually. And whoever had maintained the property before me had done so thoroughly enough that I couldn't shake the same thought returning over and over. Why did they need me here right now? That was the thing I didn't have language for at the time. A neglected place makes sense when someone hires a caretaker. A failing place makes sense. A damaged place makes sense. This place didn't feel neglected. It felt preserved. Maintained. Ready. The house didn't feel abandoned. It felt occupied by routine, as if someone had been living there right up until I arrived. The house didn't feel abandoned. It felt occupied by routine, as if someone had been living there right up until I arrived. I told myself the only sensible thing to do was keep moving. Unpack later. Think later. Unease gets louder when you feed it, and after a full day of driving, I still had enough practical instinct left to focus on the things I could verify with my own hands. So I started with the systems. The generator sat in a separate utility outbuilding about 50 yards from the main house, just as the manual said it would. It was larger and newer than I expected, high-end, automatic transfer capable, enclosed against weather, with fuel reserve sufficient to carry the whole estate for an extended period if the weather knocked out primary service. A maintenance log hung nearby in a clear plastic sleeve. The most recent entries were only 2 weeks old. That gave me pause. Again, it wasn't alarming by itself. If Blackwell paid a crew to service the place before I arrived, that made sense. But the whole setup had the same problem as the grounds and the house itself. It didn't feel like a property waiting to be taken over. It felt like one that had been handed off in motion. The well system was in similarly perfect shape. Filtration components had been replaced recently. Water pressure was strong. Chemicals and backup parts were lined up on shelves in the utility room with a kind of neatness that suggests habit, not preparation. Whoever had last worked there had been organized. Thorough. Comfortable enough with the place to leave it in order, not just tidy it up for a replacement. By then twilight was gathering outside the windows in deep blue layers. I made my way back inside and checked the communication setup in the office just off the main room. The computer powered on without issue. Satellite connection was active, but as the contract had warned, access was heavily restricted. No browsing. No streaming. No random internet. Email only. A machine built to send reports and little else. I tested it with the one message I felt obligated to send. Beth, made it to the property. Everything's okay. Place is much nicer than I expected. No cell service, and internet is limited to email only, so this may be the only way I can stay in touch. Don't worry if replies are slow. Love you. Tom. I hovered over the send button longer than I needed to. Part of that was because I hated how thin the message looked once it was written. Too casual. Too brief. It said almost nothing true about how I felt in that moment, but I didn't want to worry her, and I didn't have the energy to explain a feeling I couldn't justify. So I sent it. The message went through with a small confirmation chime that sounded strangely loud in the quiet office. After that, I unpacked enough to make the place livable. Rifle case near the stairs. Shotgun secured, but accessible. Food into cabinets where there was room. Tools by the mudroom. Boots by the door. A process I'd done some version of 100 times before in cabins and temporary camps, except this place made the ritual feel almost theatrical. Every piece of practical gear I brought with me looked rougher and less certain once it was set against the polished surfaces and expensive fixtures of that house. The pantry and refrigerator were exactly as Blackwell had promised, fully stocked, and then some. Canned goods. Dry staples. Freezer-packed meat. Bottled water. Spirits. Coffee. More than enough to support one person for months. Enough, honestly, that my own extra supplies had been almost unnecessary. That thought stayed with me. Not because it was suspicious in itself, but because the entire property kept presenting the same contradiction. They wanted a caretaker. Fine. But whoever had arranged this place had not prepared for struggle, inconvenience, or improvisation. They had prepared for containment. As evening settled in, I made myself a simple dinner. Nothing special. Something warm and quick. I carried the plate out to the back deck, wanting one last look at the property before darkness erased the edges of it. The view out there should have calmed me. The land sloped away behind the house in a gradual fall toward dense timber. Beyond that, the darkening rise of mountains held the last of the sunlight on their upper edges, turning the ridgelines gold for a few final minutes before the light bled out of them completely. The air smelled clean, pine, earth, and cold stone. If I'd come there as a guest, with no contract and no strange conditions hanging over me, I might have thought it was one of the most beautiful places I'd ever seen. For a little while, it was peaceful. Birds still moved in the trees. I could hear the rustle of brush now and then from small animals moving in the undergrowth. Wind touched the tops of the pines and moved on. Then everything stopped. I don't mean it got quieter. I mean it stopped. The sound left the forest in a way I have never heard before or since. Not gradually. Not naturally. 1 second the woods were alive in the ordinary background way they always are, and the next they had gone still all at once, as if something had passed through them and silenced every living thing in its path. I lowered my fork and looked up. The silence seemed to travel. That's the only way I can describe it. It moved across the tree line from east to west like an invisible front, and where it passed, everything went dead quiet. Then I saw the deer. A small group burst from the trees at full speed, maybe 100 yards downslope from the house. They weren't moving like they'd merely been startled. They were running in blind, violent panic, heads low, bodies stretched, legs churning hard enough to stumble over themselves as they crossed the open patch behind the property and disappeared back into the darker timber beyond. I stood up instinctively and stared into the place they'd come from, waiting to see what had driven them out. Nothing followed. No bear. No cougar. No wolf. No shape in the brush. No sound. No movement at all. Just the darkening wall of forest and that heavy unnatural silence hanging over it. I stayed there longer than I should have, my dinner cooling on the plate, trying to force some explanation into place. A predator could spook deer, sure. But not like that. Not with the woods going silent beforehand. Not with that sense, irrational but immediate, that whatever had moved through those trees hadn't merely disturbed the wildlife. It had emptied the space around itself. By the time I went back inside, full dark had settled over the property. The floodlights around the immediate grounds cut clean yellow shapes across the gravel and outer yard, but beyond that the forest had become a solid black mass. No detail. No depth. Just a wall of darkness pressing against the edge of the light. I locked the back door, then checked the front. Then I checked them again. That was the beginning of a pattern I wouldn't recognize until later, the way practical caution started quietly hardening into ritual. I spent the next couple of hours trying to normalize the evening. I walked the house more thoroughly. Opened doors. Checked closets. Looked through the basement workshop and wine cellar. Went back to the manual and read sections I'd already skimmed once. Learned the layout. Marked utility shutoffs in my head. Anything to keep my thoughts busy. But all through it, I had the same sensation following me from room to room. Not that something was in the house. That something outside knew exactly where I was in it. The large windows were the worst part. During the day, they gave the place openness and light. At night they became the opposite. Great panes of black glass reflecting the rooms back at me while revealing almost nothing beyond. More than once I caught myself glancing up at them, half expecting to find a face or shape waiting just past the reach of the lights. I never saw anything. That didn't help. Eventually exhaustion won enough ground that I went upstairs and got ready for bed. I placed my rifle beside the bed before I lay down. I told myself that was just common sense in bear country. Same as I'd done in remote places before. But lying there in that large quiet bedroom, I knew I wasn't thinking about bears. The house had its own nighttime language. The refrigerator humming far below. The heating system clicking faintly through the walls. Timber settling. Pipes shifting. Ordinary sounds made unfamiliar by context. Each one seemed to rise out of the silence and vanish back into it, leaving me a little more awake after every pause. I must have drifted eventually, but not deeply. Then something cut through the dark and yanked me fully awake. A sound from outside. At first I thought it was a howl. Then I thought it was a scream. In truth, it was somewhere in between. High, thin, but carrying with it a ragged human quality that made every hair on my arms rise instantly. It came from somewhere out in the woods beyond the house, distant enough that I couldn't place it exactly, but clear enough that there was no chance I had dreamed it. I sat upright in bed, heart hammering, straining to listen. In all my years outdoors, I'd heard plenty of noises people unfamiliar with wilderness would call impossible. Mountain lions can sound like a woman being murdered. Foxes can make shrieks sharp enough to stop your blood for a second. Elk and coyotes and even certain birds can create sounds that don't sit right in the human ear. This wasn't any of those. There was too much agony in it. Too much shape. I got out of bed and crossed to the window carefully, keeping off to one side instead of standing directly in front of the glass. Outside, the yard sat motionless under the exterior lights. The driveway. The stacked wood. The dark line of trees beyond. Nothing moved. Then it came again. Closer. Not close enough to be on the property, but no longer safely far away either. The sound knifed through the night and then dropped off so abruptly that the silence after it felt worse than the noise itself. I went back to the bed, picked up the rifle, checked the chamber even though I knew perfectly well it was loaded, and carried it with me as I moved through the second floor and then back downstairs, checking every window and every locked door in the house. Front door secure. Back door secure. Mudroom locked. Basement windows latched. Nothing disturbed. Nothing visible. And all the while I had the increasingly difficult feeling that if I looked too long into one of those dark windows, something out there might look back. I eventually made it back upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed with the rifle across my knees, listening until my ears started manufacturing sounds from the strain of it. At some point, sometime after 3, exhaustion dragged me down into sleep. When it came, it wasn't restful. I dreamed of running through endless woods without ever seeing what chased me. Morning didn't make me feel safer. It just gave me something worse to look at. Morning didn't make me feel safer. It just gave me something worse to look at. I woke later than I meant to, dragged out of a shallow, ugly sleep by pale light coming through the bedroom windows. For a few seconds, in that soft, unfocused way the mind has right after waking, the house felt normal again. Just a remote place. Just a rough first night in unfamiliar surroundings. Then I remembered the sound. The scream. The second one, closer. The way I'd sat awake with the rifle across my lap, waiting for dawn like a man expecting something to test the doors. I made coffee because routine was the only thing I trusted that morning. Black, too hot, and strong enough to put a little shape back into my thoughts. Then I took the mug outside, intending to walk the immediate grounds in daylight and prove to myself that the fear from the night before had expanded some ordinary wilderness noise into something worse than it was. That's what I believed for maybe 30 seconds. Then I saw the tracks. They were in a patch of wet ground near the tree line behind the house, where the soil had stayed soft from runoff and shade. Maybe 50 yards from the back deck. Far enough not to have noticed them from the windows. Close enough to make my stomach tighten the second I understood what I was looking at. I remember setting the coffee down without meaning to. Just lowering it into the grass beside me as I stepped closer. At first, my brain tried to fit the impressions into categories I already knew. Bear. No. Moose. Maybe distorted in mud. No. Some overlap of deer and boot tracks. No. By the time I crouched beside the nearest print, there was no room left for denial. Each track was enormous. Not just larger than normal wildlife sign, wrong in proportion. The main impression was roughly 15 inches long, maybe a little more, pressed deep into the earth with enough force that the edges had collapsed slightly inward. The shape was the worst part. At a glance, there was something almost human about the arrangement. A heel. A forward pad. 5 toe marks. But that resemblance made it worse, not better, because the details broke all resemblance immediately. The toes were too long. Not splayed like a bare foot. Elongated. Pulled forward in narrow tapered shapes that ended in deep puncture-like gouges where claws had bitten into the mud. The spaces between them were wrong too, not webbed, not paw-like. Just arranged with enough humanoid logic to trigger recognition and enough distortion to make that recognition feel obscene. I reached out and held my hand over one of the prints without touching it. It dwarfed it. The claw marks had sunk so deep into the ground that when I leaned closer, I could see where wet soil had been pushed up at the edges in tiny ridges. Fresh. Recent. Whatever had made them had not passed through days ago. It had been there during the night while I was inside the house listening to something scream in the woods. I stood and forced myself to look wider. There were more. A trail of them, easy to follow once my eyes adjusted to the pattern. They came from the north side of the property, out of the trees, crossed the softer ground behind the house, then curved in a broad arc around the residence. Not close enough to suggest random movement. Not scattered. Not the path of an animal wandering. It had circled. Methodically. As if examining the house. As if checking it. I followed the line as far as I could without stepping into it. The tracks kept their distance, staying just beyond the immediate yard, then eventually turned and disappeared back toward the same northern section of forest from which they'd come. A full loop. In and out. Whatever made them had approached the house, moved around it, and left. Watching. I stood at the edge of the grass staring toward the trees where the trail vanished, and for the first time since arriving, I felt something colder than unease. Not confusion. Not nerves. Recognition. The sound I'd heard in the night had been attached to something real. Something large. Something that moved on 2 legs often enough to leave prints like that. I wish I could say I reacted with immediate urgency. That I ran back inside and contacted Blackwell at once, demanded an explanation, or packed my gear and tried to leave before the day was out. I didn't. What I did was more human than smart. I worried about how I'd sound. That's the ugly truth. I had just arrived. I'd taken a contract that already required trust on both sides. I'd been paid a huge amount of money. And now, on my first full morning, I was supposed to email my employer and say there were giant, almost human tracks circling the house. It sounded insane even in my own head. So instead, I did the practical thing. The cowardly practical thing. I went back inside, grabbed my camera, and returned to the prints to document them before the ground dried or the shape degraded. If I ended up needing proof later, I wanted it. If I decided to include them in my first weekly report, I could do that. If they never appeared again, then maybe I could convince myself they belonged to some malformed but explainable animal and save myself the humiliation of sounding panicked on day one. That was the reasoning. Rational on the surface. Rotten underneath. Because the real reason I took photographs instead of sounding the alarm was that a photographed nightmare still gives you room to pretend you're being methodical. A spoken one becomes real. I spent a long time on those pictures. Wide shots for context. Closer shots from different angles. One with my hand near the edge for scale. Another with a folding ruler from my toolkit set beside the print. I worked carefully, almost clinically, because precision gave me something to hold on to. But all through it, I kept glancing toward the trees. Not because I expected to see it. Because I couldn't stop imagining that whatever had left those tracks might still be in there, somewhere just beyond the first dark rows of pine, watching me inspect the evidence it had deliberately left behind. By the time I finished, the morning had brightened fully. Daylight should have made the forest look less threatening. It didn't. It just made it easier to see how much of it there was. The rest of the day passed in practical tasks because I forced it to. I checked the generator again. Reviewed the maintenance schedule. Walked part of the nearest boundary route marked in the manual, looking for the red blazes on trees and the fence markers Blackwell seemed so obsessed with preserving. I inventoried tools in the workshop. Moved supplies into places that made sense. Tested lights. Checked water pressure one more time. The sort of useful work that keeps a person moving when standing still would mean thinking too clearly. I kept the rifle with me most of the day. Not shouldered in panic. Just nearby. Leaning against a wall when I worked. Slung when I walked farther from the house. Another choice I could still justify on practical grounds if I didn't examine it too hard. And all day I scanned the tree line. Every movement pulled my eyes. A branch shifting in wind. A dark patch between trunks. A bird lifting from the underbrush. Nothing was ever there when I looked directly. Still, the feeling persisted. That same pressure from the night before. The sense that the property had not become empty just because the sun was up. It had only become visible enough for me to understand how easily something could remain hidden there. By late afternoon, the shadows had started lengthening again, and I found myself watching the light go with a tension I didn't want to admit. There's a particular kind of dread that only arrives when you know you're about to enter another night in a place that has already shown you enough to damage your confidence but not enough to explain itself. That evening I changed my habits without fully admitting I was doing it out of fear. I closed the curtains before sunset. All of them. Every large window on the ground floor. Every room that looked toward the woods. I told myself I wanted privacy. Better insulation. Less glare from the interior lights. That wasn't true. I did it because I could no longer stand the idea of the dark pressing against the glass while I sat exposed inside. I lit a fire in the stone fireplace and kept it going even though the heating system worked fine. The flames gave the room movement. Sound. Something alive and human to focus on that wasn't the silence outside. I ate inside that night. No deck. No watching the tree line. And every now and then, even with the curtains drawn and the fire snapping in the grate, I caught myself looking toward the covered windows with the irrational certainty that if the fabric were thin enough, I might see the outline of something standing on the other side. Nothing happened that evening. No scream. No visible movement. No fresh sound beyond the usual settling of a large house and the muted whisper of wind outside. But the knowledge of those tracks changed the shape of the place. Once you know something circled your house in the dark, the house stops feeling like shelter in the same way. It becomes a center point. A thing being observed. I told myself I needed supplies. The truth is, I needed to see another human face before I convinced myself I was imagining everything. I told myself I needed supplies. The truth is, I needed to see another human face before I convinced myself I was imagining everything. That was how I justified the drive into town the next morning. There were practical things I could point to if I wanted to make the decision sound reasonable. More batteries. A better first aid kit. A few tools I'd noticed were missing from the workshop inventory. Maybe extra canned food, even though the house already had more than enough. But if I'm honest, those were excuses I built after the decision was already made. What I really wanted was contact. Conversation. Proof that I still belonged to a world where people stood behind counters and poured coffee and worried about ordinary things. I left after breakfast with the truck keys in one hand and the uneasy feeling from the previous night still sitting low in my chest. The morning itself looked harmless enough. Cold, clear air. Birdsong back in the trees. A chipmunk darting across the gravel drive. The sort of normal mountain stillness that makes nighttime fear feel theatrical in hindsight. But that illusion didn't last long. The drive down from the property felt subtly different in daylight. Less hostile, maybe, but only on the surface. The road twisted through the same heavy timber, the same steep curves and narrowing stretches, yet now and then I found myself anticipating a turn before I reached it. Knowing where the road would break left around a stand of rock. Knowing where the trees would thin for a second and reveal a distant slope. That same impossible familiarity again. Not strong enough to stop me. Just strong enough to bother me. According to the local map I'd found in the office, the nearest town was Coram, barely more than a small service stop for people moving through the area, maybe 20 miles from the property depending on which road you took. It took less time than I expected to reach it, and when the trees finally opened enough to reveal buildings, I felt an immediate, almost embarrassing relief. Coram was the sort of town you could miss if you blinked on the highway. A handful of buildings set along a road. A general store with gas pumps out front. A diner farther down. A post office. A few scattered homes beyond that. Pickup trucks and older sedans parked along the shoulder. Nothing about it suggested mystery or threat. If anything, it looked so ordinary that I remember feeling a little foolish for how tightly wound I'd become over one strange night and a set of impossible tracks. That feeling lasted until I stepped into Sullivan's General Store. A bell jingled overhead when I opened the door. Warm air rolled over me carrying the smells of old wood, coffee, produce, and the faint dustiness that clings to stores where half the stock seems to have lived there longer than the customers. The interior was narrow but well kept. Shelves of canned goods, hardware, batteries, snacks, local maps, basic outdoor gear. A practical little place. Behind the counter stood a woman with auburn hair pulled back in a ponytail. Mid-30s maybe. Alert eyes. Friendly face. The second she saw me, she smiled. Not the neutral smile people give strangers. The kind you give someone you already know. Thomas Mitchell, she called cheerfully. Back already? I thought you usually came in on Thursdays. I stopped walking. Not slowed. Stopped. For one of those strange suspended moments where a sentence enters your ears correctly, but your mind refuses to place it. I looked behind me first. Actually behind me, like there might be another man in the doorway. There wasn't. The woman's smile faltered just slightly when she saw my expression. I'm sorry, I said. Have we met? That got the attention of two other customers almost immediately. An older man near a rack of fishing tackle turned his head. A woman by the canned goods looked over the top of her basket. The woman at the register blinked once, then gave a little laugh that sounded almost rehearsed. Very funny, Tom. You've been coming in here every week for, what, years now? I kept walking toward the counter slowly, not because I meant to, but because my body hadn't caught up to what my mind was doing. No, I said. I think you've got me confused with somebody else. Her smile had changed by then. Still present, but thinner. Studying me. Emma, I said, glancing at the painted store name on the window and then back to her, right? I've never been here before. I just arrived at the Blackwell property yesterday. The older man near the fishing tackle gave a small nod in my direction, casual as anything. Mitchell, he said. Good to see you. Any luck with those night fishing spots I told you about last month? The floor seemed to shift under me. Not physically, but that's the closest word for it. A sense of footing changing all at once. I stared at him. He looked genuinely expectant. Not joking. Not performing. He said it like we'd had a real conversation, one he assumed I remembered as clearly as he did. Before I could respond, the woman by the canned goods chimed in too. You helped my son when his car broke down last winter, she said. Out by the East Fork Road. Don't you remember? I turned back to Emma and saw something in her face I hadn't noticed at first. Confusion, yes. But behind that, a flicker of fear. Not for herself. For me. I think there's some misunderstanding, I said carefully, trying to keep my voice level and hearing in real time how difficult that had become. I signed the contract with William Blackwell last week. I got to the estate yesterday. This is my first time in Coram. The store had gone subtly quieter. No one was staring outright, but the air had changed. The customers still moved, still touched items on shelves, still stood where they were, but the normal rhythm of small-town ease had tightened around my words. Emma glanced toward the wall behind her. At first I thought she was looking for something to say. Then I realized she was looking at the calendar. When her eyes came back to me, the friendliness was almost gone. What can I help you with today? She asked. The shift was so sudden it chilled me more than if she denied everything. I hesitated. You just said I come in here all the time. People make mistakes. It wasn't just you. Emma looked past me briefly, as if checking whether anyone was listening too closely. Then she leaned forward just slightly when she handed me a shopping basket. Just get what you need, she said quietly. I stood there for another second before finally doing exactly that, because I didn't know what else to do. I moved through the aisles in a kind of low-grade shock, picking up the things I'd supposedly come for: batteries, a small tool set, better medical supplies, a few extra food items, without really seeing them. But as I moved, I caught people glancing at me. Not with curiosity. Recognition. The sort of absent, settled recognition people reserve for familiar faces. A nod. A half-smile. A look that says, there he is. Every one of them made my pulse climb a little higher. When I returned to the counter, Emma rang up the items without her earlier warmth. Her hands were steady, but she still avoided my eyes more than once. That'll be $43.27, she said. I handed over my card. As the machine processed the payment, she leaned forward slightly and lowered her voice enough that it barely carried beyond the counter. Be careful up there, Tom, she said. The full moon's coming in a couple weeks. I looked up sharply. What does that mean? But she had already straightened. The transaction approved. She handed me the receipt with a professional smile that looked pasted on over something much less stable. Have a good day now. I took the bag and stepped back into the cold with a feeling that had moved beyond unease and into something much harder to control. The street outside looked exactly the same as it had when I arrived. A couple trucks. Quiet road. The diner sign down at the end of the block. A harmless little town under a pale mountain sky, which only made what had just happened feel worse. I was halfway to my truck when a voice behind me stopped me. Mitchell. I turned. An older man stood near the side of the building, where he'd apparently been leaning against the wall. He wore a faded trucker cap and a canvas jacket darkened at the elbows with age. White mustache. Weathered face. The kind of man who looked like he'd lived in the same radius his entire life and had no reason to apologize for it. "You got a minute?" he asked. Something about him felt different from the others. Less casual. Less certain of how to approach me. "Depends," I said. He gave a short nod. Robert Thompson. The name meant nothing to me. He studied my face for a moment in silence, and then I saw it, the exact instant he realized I wasn't playing some joke on him. His expression changed. "How's the situation up at the Blackwell place?" he asked. "What situation?" He frowned. Not suspiciously. More like a man trying to align two pieces of information that should have matched and didn't. Then he said, almost to himself, "You really don't remember, do you?" That sentence cut deeper than anything else had. Because unlike the others, he sounded like he believed me. I took a step toward him. Remember what? But he was already backing away. He shook his head once, eyes dropping to the ground, then looked back at me with something close to pity. "Sorry," he muttered. "Must have been mistaken." Then he turned and walked away before I could stop him. I stood there with the plastic bag in one hand and a cold spreading sensation in my stomach that made the whole town feel subtly unreal. I should have gone straight back to the estate. I know that. But by then I was shaky enough that I told myself I needed to sit down somewhere, drink coffee, eat something hot, and get my head under control before getting behind the wheel again. So I went to the diner. It sat at the far end of the road in one of those low roadside buildings with wide windows and chrome trim, trying to look more cheerful than age had allowed. Inside, it was half full. A few men at the counter in work jackets. A family near the front. 2 older women in a booth by the window. The smell of coffee and grease and toast hit me the second I stepped in. I picked a booth near the back, mostly because it gave me a wall behind me and a clear view of the room. I had barely sat down when a young blonde waitress walked over carrying a coffee pot. She set a mug in front of me, filled it without asking, and smiled. "Hey Tom," she said. "The usual today?" I looked up at her name tag. Judy. My mouth had gone dry. What would my usual be? I asked. She laughed lightly. "Denver omelet. Hash browns extra crispy. Sourdough toast. Same as every Thursday." The smile began to slip from her face as she looked at me more closely. "Tom," she said, quieter now. "You okay?" I gripped the edge of the table. "I've never been here before." That came out harder than I intended. Too sharp. A couple of heads turned from nearby tables. Judy blinked, confused. "But you come in every Thursday morning. You always sit in this booth. You drink your coffee black. You read the paper while you wait. You leave a $5 tip even when your meal costs less than 10. She was so matter-of-fact that it somehow felt more terrifying than if she'd laughed in my face. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Just calm familiarity. I looked around the diner then, really looked, and had the awful sense that if I asked anyone else in the room, they'd tell me the same thing. "What's today's date?" I asked. Judy pointed toward a little paper calendar taped near the register. "October 17th. I stared at it. Then I pulled out my phone. The screen lit up in my hand. October 17th. For a second, I genuinely couldn't understand what I was seeing. Not emotionally. Mechanically. Like the numbers themselves no longer attached properly to meaning. I had arrived at the property on October 5th. Yesterday. Hadn't I? I opened my call history with fingers that suddenly felt clumsy. My last call with Beth was still there. October 4th. The night before I left Wyoming. I looked back at the date on the screen. October 17th. 12 days. 12 days missing. The edges of the room seemed to distort slightly then, not visually, not in any dramatic cinematic way. More like the diner had become too bright and too loud all at once. Forks clinking. Someone laughing at the counter. Coffee pouring somewhere behind me. Normal sounds turning hostile because they continued so indifferently while my sense of time collapsed in my hands. "I need to go," I said, standing too fast. My knee bumped the table. Coffee sloshed over the lip of the mug. "Tom," Judy started. "I'm fine." I wasn't. I threw cash on the table, grabbed my bag from the floor, and left before anyone could ask me anything else. Outside, the cold air hit hard enough to make me gasp. I made it to the truck and got inside, then just sat there with both hands on the steering wheel, breathing through the first real spike of panic I'd had since getting to Montana. I checked the date again. Same answer. I checked my phone battery, call log, message history, anything that might suggest the date was wrong or the device had glitched. Nothing. Everything agreed. 12 days were gone. Not hazy. Not blurred together. Gone. And the people in town had spent the morning speaking to me as if those missing days had not only existed, but had been normal. Familiar. Repeated often enough to form habits. By the time I got back to the house, I was no longer afraid of the woods. I was afraid of my own memory. By the time I got back to the house, I was no longer afraid of the woods. I was afraid of my own memory. I pulled into the driveway too fast, gravel spraying under the tires, and for one irrational second I expected the house to look different. I don't know how. Older, maybe. More lived in. Or damaged in some way that would confirm those missing 12 days had happened somewhere outside me, not inside me. But the estate looked exactly as it had that morning. The porch. The stacked firewood. The clean line of the drive. The dark forest waiting just beyond the edge of the maintained grounds. Nothing had changed. Which only made it worse. I killed the engine and sat there with my hands still locked on the wheel, staring at the front door and trying to force my breathing back into something steady. Panic wants action, but fear of your own mind does something different. It freezes you in place because every next step comes with a possibility that you'll find more evidence you can't explain. Eventually I got out, grabbed the supplies I'd bought in town, and went straight to the office. Not the kitchen. Not the bedroom. Not the back windows where the tree line waited. The office. The computer was still on the desk exactly where I'd left it, screen dark, harmless looking, connected to the same restricted satellite system I had tested on my first night. I sat down, woke it, opened the email client, and went directly to sent messages. What I found there is the moment the situation stopped feeling merely strange and became something far worse. There were 2 weekly reports already sent to William Blackwell. One dated October 8th. The second dated October 15th. For a while I just stared at them without opening either one. The dates alone were enough to make my throat tighten. Those weren't empty auto-generated messages or blank submissions sent by mistake. Each one had a subject line in the exact format outlined in the manual. Weekly Property Report, Blackwell Estate, October 8th. Weekly Property Report, Blackwell Estate, October 15th. I clicked the first one. It opened instantly. And I was looking at my own words. There's no better way to say that. The tone was mine. The phrasing was mine. Practical. Concise. Slightly dry. The way I've always written when I'm trying to sound professional. If someone had shown me that report under any other circumstances, I would have recognized it as my writing without hesitation. The body of the email included a clean summary of completed tasks. Generator inspection performed. Fuel levels checked and logged. Western fence line assessed. 2 damaged boundary markers reinforced. Minor roof issue above south-facing eave repaired. Observed deer movement in lower eastern clearing. No predator sign confirmed. General supply inventory updated. I read it once. Then again. Then I opened the second report. Same thing. Same voice. Same calm, organized account of work I had absolutely no memory of doing. This one was even more detailed. Brush cleared from a section of the northern boundary. Water filtration chemicals replaced and tested. Unusual tracks observed in North Woods, possibly large elk. Weather conditions summarized. Notes about securing loose equipment ahead of incoming cold. I actually leaned back from the screen at that point, not because I was calmer, but because my body seemed to need physical distance from what I was seeing. I had been functioning. That was the part that truly broke something inside me. It would have been easier, much easier, if the missing days had come with signs of chaos. Blank messages. Confused notes. Damaged rooms. Evidence that I had been unconscious, sick, or delirious. But this? This meant I had been up and moving and working. Walking the property. Maintaining the systems. Writing coherent reports. Possibly going into town. Holding conversations. Living a life I had no memory of at all. There's a special kind of fear that comes with realizing you may have continued being yourself while absent from your own mind. Not blacked out in the drunk sense. Not dissociated in some vague psychological way. Present enough to function. Gone enough to lose all ownership of it. I scrolled through the sent folder hoping for more clues and somehow dreading them at the same time. There were no personal emails. No strange messages to Beth. No frantic drafts. Just the reports. Clean, measured, regular. As if those missing days had been routine. I sat there in that chair listening to the faint hum of the computer and the almost inaudible tick of the house settling around me, and for the first time since arriving, I thought seriously, truly seriously, that something might be wrong with my mind. Not the supernatural kind of wrong. Not yet. Something medical. Neurological. A stress response. A fugue state. Some delayed consequence of exhaustion, isolation, or whatever invisible crack had opened in me without my noticing. Then another thought followed immediately behind it, colder and worse. If I was losing time, I needed a record before I lost more. I went upstairs, dug through my gear, and found a small notebook I usually carried on longer guiding trips, along with a pen. Nothing fancy. Weather-resistant pages. Spiral-bound. Practical. I brought it back down to the office and sat at the desk again, this time not to search but to anchor myself. At the top of the first page, I wrote the date exactly as my phone and the town calendar had shown it. October 17th. Then I started writing. Everything. The email offer. The contract. The drive. The feeling of familiarity on the road. The outfitter's warning. The house. The note from William. The scream in the woods. The tracks. The trip to Coram. Emma calling me by name. Judy knowing my breakfast order. Robert Thompson asking if I remembered. The date. The missing 12 days. The reports I just found in my sent folder. I wrote fast at first, trying to get the facts down before fear could distort them. Then slower as the details sharpened. The more I put on paper, the more I understood I wasn't writing a memory. I was building evidence against whatever was happening to me. That distinction mattered. Memory can be doubted. A written record, especially one made in the moment, gives you something to return to when your own mind starts feeling compromised. When I finished, my hand hurt. I read back through everything once, and for a few minutes I had the strange detached feeling of reviewing someone else's account. A man arrives at an isolated estate. Strange warnings. Missing days. People in town know him. It would have sounded like bad fiction if I hadn't been sitting inside the exact house where it was happening. Then I turned to a fresh page and wrote, in block letters this time. Check the date every morning and night. Write everything down. I tore the page out and took it upstairs to the bathroom. There was a roll of tape in my gear bag, and I used 2 strips to fix the note to the mirror at eye level, right where I'd see it every time I brushed my teeth or washed my face. It looked absurd there. Simple. Desperate. The kind of thing you'd expect from someone unraveling in a survival story, not from yourself. I left it anyway. Because by then, preserving normal appearances had become meaningless. The rest of that evening passed in a haze of small deliberate actions. I unpacked the supplies from town, put the extra batteries in the drawer by the flashlight, added the new first aid kit to the bathroom cabinet, sorted tools, checked the date again, checked my phone again, checked the sent folder one more time as if the reports might somehow disappear if I looked often enough. Outside, afternoon started thinning toward dusk. I noticed because the light in the office shifted from white to gray, and once again my eyes kept drifting toward the windows, toward the forest, toward the line where what I could explain ended and the dark started collecting. That night I slept with the rifle even closer to the bed than before. The journal became the first thing I touched in the morning and the last thing I updated before trying to sleep. Every day after that, I tracked myself with the kind of precision usually reserved for search patterns and survival logs. I wrote down the date as soon as I woke up. I checked my phone against it. I noted the time I ate, the systems I inspected, the trails I walked, what the weather looked like, what I heard in the woods, whether I found any new tracks, whether the house felt normal, whether I felt normal. I took photographs whenever I worked outside, downloaded them at night, cross-checked them with the journal. If I walked a boundary route, I noted it. If I repaired anything, I noted it. If I heard something after dark, I noted it. I even recorded my moods at times, because by then I no longer trusted the line between what I experienced and what I remembered. Those next few days were some of the most exhausting of my life, and not because the work was hard. Because vigilance is hard. Living inside your own head while treating it like a suspect is hard. Every morning I expected to wake and discover another gap. Another missing page in my own life. Every night I half believed I'd write in the notebook, fall asleep, and wake to a date that no longer belonged to me. But the journal held. For 3 days, at least, reality stayed pinned down. I worked. I checked. I wrote. The estate remained outwardly the same, but my relationship to it changed completely. I no longer moved through it like a caretaker settling into routine. I moved through it like a witness preserving evidence. And with every hour, one question kept returning stronger than the others. Why did the people in Coram know me? Not in theory. Not as rumor. Personally. With habits and histories and details no stranger could invent. That question festered until it became impossible to ignore. For 3 days, the journal held reality together. On the 4th day, I went back to town for answers. If you want part 2, make sure you like the video, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you don't miss it when it goes live.